What happens when Hollywood royalty sits down for what should be a lighthearted late-night chat, only to have the conversation spiral into one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history? Tonight we're diving into the explosive confrontation between Richard Gere and Jimmy Fallon that had audiences gasping and producers scrambling. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can unravel when two very different personalities clash. On live television, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think really triggered this whole situation. The Tonight Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as Richard Gere made his way to the guest chair. Jimmy Fallon, ever the enthusiastic host, flashed his trademark grin as the cameras began rolling. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Richard Gere," Jimmy announced, his voice carrying that familiar upbeat tone that had made him a late-night staple. Richard settled into his chair with the practiced ease of someone who had done hundreds of these interviews. He offered a polite smile to the audience, but there was something different about his demeanor tonight, something more reserved than usual. "Richard, great to have you back on the show," Jimmy began, leaning forward with genuine excitement. "I have to ask, you've been pretty quiet lately about your upcoming projects. What's keeping you busy these days?" "Well, Jimmy," Richard started, his voice measured, "I've been selective about what I choose to discuss publicly. Not everything needs to be entertainment." The slight edge in Richard's tone wasn't lost on Jimmy, though the host maintained his cheerful facade. Of course. But come on, you're Richard Gere. People want to know what you're up to." "Do they though?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or do they want to know what you think they should want to know?" Jimmy laughed, but it was slightly forced. "I'm not sure I follow. We're just having a conversation here, are we?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Jimmy with an intensity that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably. "Because it feels more like you're trying to extract sound bites for your shows, social media clips." The audience fell silent. This wasn't the playful banter they were used to seeing on The Tonight Show. Jimmy's smile flickered for just a moment before he recovered. "Hey, that's not fair," Jimmy replied, his tone still light but with a hint of defensiveness creeping. "And I'm genuinely interested in what you're working on. That's what we do here. We celebrate our guests and their projects." "Celebrate," Richard repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that what you call it when you invite someone on your show just to ask them about their personal life and relationships from 30 years ago?" Jimmy's expression shifted slightly. "I haven't asked you about any relationships." "Richard, not yet," Richard said pointedly, "but we both know it's coming. It always comes. The obligatory question about my past, my activism, my political views, anything that might generate a headline." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Jimmy glanced quickly at his notes, then back at Richard, clearly trying to navigate this unexpected turn. "Look, I think there might be some misunderstanding here," Jimmy said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I invited you on because you're a legend, and people genuinely want to hear from you. That's it." Richard studied Jimmy for a long moment before responding. "A legend. Interesting choice of words. You know what I think, Jimmy? I think you invited me on because my name generates clicks and views, and you're hoping I'll say something controversial that your producers can turn into viral content." The audience was completely silent now, the usual laughter and applause replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that seemed to amplify every small sound in the studio. "That's really not true," Jimmy protested, and for the first time, his famous smile completely disappeared. "I have nothing but respect for you and your work." "Respect," Richard echoed. "If you respected me, you wouldn't have your researchers dig up questions designed to put me in uncomfortable positions. You wouldn't treat this conversation like it's content for your highlight reel." Jimmy's jaw tightened slightly. "You know what, Richard, I think you might be projecting here. I don't know what's going on with you tonight, but this isn't about exploitation or viral content. This is about having a normal conversation with a guest." "Normal?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nothing about this is normal, Jimmy. You sit behind that desk every night, asking celebrities softball questions while pretending to be their friend. But the moment the cameras stop rolling, do you even remember their names?" The question hit Jimmy harder than expected. His cheerful demeanor was cracking, replaced by something more genuine but also more defensive. "Of course, I remember," Jimmy said, his voice rising slightly. "I've interviewed hundreds of people, and I care about every single conversation." "Hundreds of people," Richard repeated. "Exactly my point. We're all just content to you, aren't we? Just another episode in your endless stream of manufactured entertainment." Jimmy set his cards down on his desk, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You know what? I think you're being incredibly unfair right now. I work hard to make sure every guest feels welcome and comfortable on this show." "Comfortable," Richard said with a bitter smile. "Is that what you think this is? Because I have to tell you, Jimmy, I've never felt less comfortable in my life." Jimmy's face flushed slightly, the first real crack in his professional composure. "Well, maybe that's on you, Richard. Maybe you came here tonight looking for a fight." "Looking for a fight?" Richard's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. I came here because your people called my people and said you wanted to have a meaningful conversation about my work. What I found instead was another host, more interested in his own performance than his guest. The studio audience was completely captivated now, witnessing something they had never seen before on The Tonight Show. This wasn't scripted banter or planned controversy. This was real tension playing out in real time. Jimmy leaned forward, his famous affability replaced by something sharper. My performance. You want to talk about performance? You've been performing disdain since the moment you sat down. I asked you one simple question about your projects. One simple question, Richard repeated, followed by your little dig about me being quiet lately, followed by your assumption that people are entitled to know everything about my life. You call that simple? I call that conversation. Jimmy shot back. You know the thing that happens between two people when one of them isn't acting like they're too good to be here. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard's expression shifted, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Too good to be here, he said slowly. That's interesting. Tell me, Jimmy, when was the last time you had a conversation, a real conversation, where you weren't performing for an audience? Jimmy's mouth opened and closed for a moment. Every day, I have real conversations every day. Do you, Richard? Pressed, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've forgotten how to talk to people without a script. Everything is a bit, everything is content, everything is designed to get a laugh or a reaction. That's my job, Jimmy said, his voice rising. This is a comedy show. People tune in to laugh and have a good time. And there it is, Richard said, sitting back with satisfaction. Your job, not a conversation, not genuine interest, just a job. Just another day at the office for Jimmy Fallon. The audience was shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This had gone far beyond awkward television into something genuinely uncomfortable to witness. Jimmy's hands gripped the edge of his desk. You know what your problem is, Richard? You think being miserable makes you deep. You think treating people poorly makes you authentic. And you think being perpetually cheerful makes you likable. Richard countered without missing a beat. But what happens when the cameras stop rolling? Jimmy, who are you when you're not performing happiness for strangers? I'm the same person, Jimmy insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Richard leaned forward now, his gaze intense. Because I've been in this business for over 4 decades, and I can tell when someone has lost themselves in their public persona. The question is, do you even know who you are anymore without the audience? Jimmy's face went pale. That's enough. You don't know anything about me, don't I? Richard's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, which somehow made it more cutting. I know you laugh at your own jokes before anyone else does. I know you interrupt your guests when they're trying to give thoughtful answers because you're afraid of dead air. I know you'd rather tell a mediocre joke than have a moment of genuine human connection. Stop, Jimmy said, his voice tight. I know you surround yourself with writers and producers who tell you how funny you are. Because deep down you're terrified that without the laughter, there's nothing left. Richard continued relentlessly. Jimmy stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. I said stop. The truth makes you uncomfortable, doesn't it? Richard remained seated, unnaturally calm. You want to talk about performance? Your entire life is a performance. When was the last time you had a quiet moment alone with your own thoughts without immediately reaching for your phone or finding something to distract yourself? You don't get to psychoanalyze me, Jimmy said, his voice shaking with anger. You don't know me. You don't know my life. I know enough, Richard replied. I know you're standing behind that desk right now trying to figure out how to turn this into a bit, how to make this funny, because the alternative is actually dealing with what I'm saying. Jimmy's hands were visibly trembling now. This is my show. These are my people. You don't get to come here and attack me. I'm not attacking you, Jimmy, Richard said, his tone softening just slightly. I'm trying to have the real conversation you claimed you wanted, but you can't handle it, can you? Because real conversations don't have laugh tracks. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Jimmy looked out at his audience, then at his band, then at the cameras, as if seeking some kind of rescue. That wasn't coming. You want real, Jimmy finally said, his voice low and dangerous. Here's real. You're a washed-up actor who hasn't had a relevant role in years. Sitting here lecturing me about authenticity while you haven't been authentic about anything in your entire career. Or what? Richard asked. You'll have security escort me out. You'll cut to commercial. You'll edit this out and pretend it never happened. Jimmy looked desperately toward the control booth, but no help was coming. The cameras kept rolling. Here's what's really happening here, Jimmy, Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. For once in your career, you're in a conversation you can't control. You can't cut away. You can't make a joke. You can't deflect with some silly game or meaningless small talk. You're forced to actually engage with another human being, and you're completely out of your depth. That's not true, Jimmy protested weakly. Isn't it? Richard gestured toward the audience. Look at them, Jimmy, look at your audience. They're not laughing. They're not clapping. They're watching you struggle with basic human interaction without your safety net of prepared material. Jimmy's eyes darted to the audience, and what he saw there clearly shook him. They weren't looking at him with their usual adoration. They were looking at him with something closer to pity. You want to know what's washed up? Richard pressed on. It's the idea that celebrity culture matters more than genuine human connection. It's the notion that everything has to be packaged and sanitized for mass consumption. It's hosts like you who have turned conversation into commodity. Stop lecturing me, Jimmy snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. You think you're so much better than everyone else, but you're just bitter. You're bitter because the world moved on without you. Richard smiled, but it wasn't pleasant. The world moved on, Jimmy, and you know what it moved toward? Artificial connections, surface-level interactions, and people like you who mistake popularity for purpose. People like me. Jimmy's voice was getting louder now. People like me entertain millions of people every night. We bring joy into their lives. You bring distraction, Richard corrected. There's a difference. Joy comes from genuine experience, from real emotion, from authentic moments between people. What you do is manufacture happiness for people too afraid to find it themselves. Jimmy slammed his hand on his desk, the sound echoing through the silent studio. Who do you think you are? You come on my show, in my house, in front of my audience, and you attack everything I've built. I'm someone who remembers when entertainment meant something more than getting people to forget their problems for 30 minutes. Richard replied, I'm someone who thinks art should challenge people, not just pacify them. Art. Jimmy laughed harshly. You made Pretty Woman, Richard. You want to talk about art versus entertainment. At least Pretty Woman had something to say about class and society. Richard shot back. What does your show say? What message are you sending beyond by this product? Laugh at this joke. Don't think too hard about anything important. Jimmy was fully red-faced now, his famous composure completely shattered. My show brings people together. It creates shared experiences. It helps people get through difficult times. By avoiding anything difficult, Richard countered. By turning every serious topic into a punchline. By treating your guests like performing monkeys, there to dance for your audience's amusement. That's enough. Jimmy shouted, pointing toward the exit. Get out. Get out of my studio. There it is, Richard said with grim satisfaction. When you can't handle the conversation anymore, you shut it down. Just like you shut down any topic that might make your audience think too hard or feel too much. Security, Jimmy called out, his voice breaking. You don't need security, Jimmy, Richard said, already moving toward the edge of the stage. I'll leave. But I want you and everyone watching to understand something. This is what happens when you scratch the surface of celebrity culture. This is what's underneath all the smiles and scripted moments. Jimmy was breathing heavily, his hands shaking as he gripped his desk. You're unhinged. You're completely unhinged. No, Jimmy, Richard said, turning back one final time. I'm awake. And that terrifies you because you've been sleepwalking through your career for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to be fully conscious during a conversation. The studio remained frozen as Richard walked slowly across the stage, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Jimmy stood behind his desk, chest heaving, watching his guest's departure with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This is live television, folks, Jimmy said suddenly, his voice cracking as he tried to salvage something from the wreckage. Sometimes things get a little heated. Richard stopped walking and turned around, his expression incredulous. Even now, even after everything we just discussed, you're trying to turn this into entertainment. It's my job too, Jimmy started, but Richard cut him off. Your job, Richard said, shaking his head slowly. Do you hear yourself? Your guest just walked off your stage. Your audience is sitting in stunned silence, and you're still trying to perform. Jimmy's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, anger, and something that might have been recognition. What do you want me to do? This is live television. I want you to be human for 30 seconds, Richard said, his voice carrying a note of genuine sadness now. I want you to acknowledge that what just happened here was real, not content. The camera operators were getting signals from the control booth, but nobody knew what to do. This had gone so far off script that there was no protocol to follow. You think I'm not human? Jimmy asked, and for the first time all night, his voice carried genuine hurt instead of defensive anger. I think you've forgotten how to be, Richard replied. I think you've been performing for so long that you don't know where Jimmy Fallon ends and the Tonight Show host begins. Jimmy looked out at his audience, then at his band, then back at Richard. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't know anymore. The admission seemed to surprise even Jimmy himself. Richard studied his face carefully. That's the first honest thing you've said since I sat down, Richard said, and look how much more interesting this conversation became the moment you stopped performing. Jimmy ran his hand through his hair, carefully styled appearance now disheveled. I don't know how to do this without performing. This is all I know. That's the tragedy of it, Richard said, his anger seeming to dissipate into something closer to pity. You're actually an intelligent person, Jimmy, but you've built your entire career on avoiding intelligence, on dumbing everything down until it's safe and palatable. People don't want complex, Jimmy said weakly. They want to laugh. They want to feel good. People want what you give them, Richard corrected, and you've trained them to expect nothing more than empty calories. But they're capable of so much more, and so are you. Jimmy sat down heavily in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him. So what am I supposed to do? Change everything overnight. Become someone completely different. You're to remember why you wanted to do this in the first place, Richard said. Before the ratings, before the viral clips, before the machine took over. What made you think you had something worth saying? The question seemed to hit Jimmy like a physical blow. He was quiet for a long moment, the studio holding its collective breath. I wanted to make people happy, Jimmy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, and instead you've made them dependent on artificial happiness. Richard replied, you've taught them that every difficult emotion should be laughed away. Every serious thought should be interrupted with a joke. Jimmy looked up at Richard, and for the first time all evening, his expression was completely unguarded. I don't know how to fix that. Start by having one real conversation, Richard said. Just one. See what happens when you actually listen to someone instead of waiting for your turn to perform. With you, Jimmy asked. Richard shook his head. It's too late for that. I'm leaving. But maybe with your next guest. Maybe tomorrow night, maybe start small. Why are you telling me this? Jimmy asked. If you hate everything about what I do, why do you care? Richard paused at the edge of the stage. Because I remember when television could be more than this. I remember when talk shows actually talked about things that mattered. And because somewhere under all that performance, I think there's still a person worth having a conversation with. Jimmy stared at him, speechless. But that person is going to have to choose to show up, Richard continued. And they're going to have to be brave enough to risk boring people, or making them uncomfortable, or not getting the laugh. With that, Richard Gere walked off the Tonight Show stage, leaving Jimmy Fallon alone behind his desk with an audience that didn't know whether to applaud, gasp, or simply leave. Jimmy looked into the camera, his usual sign-off nowhere to be found. Instead, he simply said, "We'll be right back," and the show cut to commercial, leaving millions of viewers to process what they had just witnessed. And there you have it, one of the most brutal takedowns in late-night television history. Richard Gere didn't just walk off Jimmy Fallon's show, he dismantled everything the show represents, and left Jimmy questioning his entire career. Was Richard out of line, or was this the wake-up call that late-night television desperately needed? Make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity moments, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Jimmy Fallon ever recovered from this encounter?